Hello, welcome to lesson number 2 of drafting pleadings and appearances, which is common for both new syllabus as well as the old syllabus students. Before we go further, let us look into the scope of lesson number 2, which is general principles of drafting. In this, we will be covering the basic meaning of what is drafting, along with the Fowler's 5 rules. Then, what is conveyancing and how different is it from drafting and contracts. And then we will look into what is the meaning of a deed, what is the meaning of an instrument, and what are documents, and also what are the rules of interpretation of deeds. Then, and the foremost and the important one, which is the kinds and the components of deeds. So we'll have a special emphasis on the components of deeds. And finally, we will see how a schema of a deed looks like. So by schema, we mean a special format. So here in the schema, I'll explain you how one single format can be used for multiple contracts, right? So the schema is fundamentally a outlook. Got it? So if that outlook is there in your mind, so if you can know how to start a deed, if you can know how to end a deed, then the fillers will be what your conceptual understanding of the respective deed or the respective subject matter of the deed is all about, right? So with this intro, let's jump into the concepts. So what is drafting? So there are multiple meanings of what drafting is, but this is what has attracted me, and also this is what I think is genuinely the meaning of the term drafting. So drafting is the synthesis of law and facts in a language form. I repeat, it is a synthesis, which is the plus of law and facts in a language form. So drafting contains both facts, like what happened between the parties, why are the parties entering into this contract, how are they going to supply the terms, so what are the supply terms, what are the distribution terms, how are they going to agree on the payments, everything comes into the ambit of drafting. But these are all the facts. I have to put all these facts in a language form, and not just facts, even the law, because it cannot be illegal. So whatever I say, whatever I genuinely put in a contract should be coming within the four walls of the legal atmosphere or the legal environment of that respective law of the land. So this is what is drafting. It is a synthesis of law and fact in a language form. Now, before we go further, it is very important to understand this Fowler's 5 rules. So I'll be giving you the relevance of drafting through my own experience, and at the same time what Fowler has stated, the 5 rules of drafting. If you can see on the screen, the 5 rules are: a good writer should endeavor to be direct. So your drafts have to be direct. You should not beat around the bush. The point which you're trying to make has to be direct. It has to be simple. So usage of complex words will not help in furtherance of the intention of the parties. It has to be as simple as possible, because the very intention of a draft is to see that even a third party reading it will understand what are the terms between two parties. It has to be brief. Agreed detailed drafts are always wanted in the corporate world, but it has to be as brief as possible. It has to be vigorous, and it has to be lucid. So now, what are these words, vigorous and lucid? By vigorous, we mean something which is forceful or strong, which means something which can be enforced against the other party. And by lucid, we mean which is that which is expressed clearly or which is easy to understand. So these are the 5 basic principles which Fowler had stated as the 5 rules of drafting. So now, from my own experience, let me tell you what actually should be a draft. So always remember, whenever in a corporate world you're drafting something, you're trying to communicate something to the other party. If suppose it is an agreement between A and B, which means both A and B are trying to enter into certain terms, 1, 2, 3, whatever be the terms are, right? So the very intention between both of them coming on track is to let each other know that I agree to these terms, you also agree to these terms, and hence we two are doing a particular contract. And now the very intention of entering into a contract is to protect the individual rights. So protection of individual rights is the funda behind a contract, correct? Or any draft for that matter. So now, why do you think we put it in writing? Because tomorrow, if either of the party infringes any of the rights of the other party, or either of the party breaches the terms of the contract, then the other party, which is the victim, would enforce this contract against the party which had caused such trouble or which had frustrated the contract. Correct? So the next important thing is enforceability, for which we need to look into the legality. Correct? So now these three I suggest should be something in your head whenever you're making any contract. Make sure that your rights are protected. Make sure that you can enforce your rights in case the other party breaches any terms of the contract. And also ensure that your document is legal. Unless you can prove that your document is legal, you cannot enforce any of your rights. Hence, this also becomes very important. So from my personal experience, I look into any draft I make, any communication I make, these three are very important tools. And now when you're making any draft, so it can be a contract, it can be a deed. We look into what those terms are, but you should be very clear as to what you want to communicate. So that should be the first and the foremost principle you should start working on. So what is it that I want to communicate? From there, your principle of draft will start. Right. So now let's come into the second important aspect of this lesson, which is conveyancing and how different it can be from drafting and contracts. So conveyance, as the name suggests, is conveying something, correct? So you are trying to convey either the property or interest in property. So conveying is the art of drafting of deeds and documents whereby property or interest in property is transferred from one person to another. So where A Limited owns a property and B Limited wants to buy that property, this particular document which transfers the title over this property to B is what is called as conveyance. So there has to be a transfer of property or there has to be a transfer of interest in property. Only then such document or deed which affects that transaction is called as a conveyance, and this process is what is called as conveyancing. So for that we can look into the definition of conveyance and the Indian Stamp Act, which says that it includes conveyance on sale or every instrument by which the property is transferred inter vivos, which is among living persons. So what all transactions can necessarily come under conveyance? Sale comes under conveyance, lease comes under conveyance, mortgage also comes under conveyance, because there is a transfer of property in terms of sale. In case of lease and mortgage, there is a transfer of interest in the property, and these documents or these deeds for that matter, so sale deed, lease deed, mortgage deed, so why do we call them deeds? So we will learn it in the subsequent slides. However, now for this slide, remember, conveyancing is when there is a transfer of a property or interest in property. Only then we call it conveyancing. Now, how do we differentiate it from drafting? So drafting is very general. So anything and everything you call drafting when you draft something. But you cannot say everything to be conveyance. Conveyance is only specific to property or interest in property. Second, so this necessarily is the difference between drafting and conveyance. So as you can see from the table here. So now let us see what is the difference between a contract and a conveyancing. Since you are in the CS professional, I assume you know the principles of contract and also the basic essential ingredients of a contract. So when we enter into a contract, what are we necessarily doing? We are agreeing on a promise. So there is a consideration. I promise to pay you some money. You promise to do some work, or you further promise to pay me some money in case the work is not done. Correct? So there is a consideration, there is a promise, or if I can put it this way, there is something, an act which you are promising to do. So which is to be done, and executory. So it is something which which remains to be performed. So assume, I'll give you an example. Let us say X Limited has entered into a contract with a Y Limited for supply of goods and services. I mean, let us say for supply of certain goods. So there are certain goods which X Limited wants to supply to Y Limited, for which they entered into a contract. Correct? So in the contract, they agreed that the goods shall be delivered within 45 days from placing of the purchase order, which is 45 days from the requisition to purchase that the goods will be delivered. Correct? So this is the term of the contract. So now, if the tenure of the term is 2 years, till the 2 years period of time, I am bound to make this supplies to you from the date of requisition. Within 45 days, I am bound to make this supply to you, which means till the second year, the last date of the contract, this contract remains to be performed. The moment the tenure of the contract is done, then we can say the contract is completed. So a contract is essentially a document which talks about the future acts the parties are supposed to do. Whereas when you come to conveyance, it is the actual creation of the rights. So what happens, I mean, in the sense that the rights gets transferred. So either your right of title over the property gets transferred, or your interest in the property gets transferred. Correct? So conveyance is like immediate action. It is not something which you do in future. So this is something which you need to remember. Now, once a contract is entered, there is a scope for you to cancel the contract during the tenure of the contract. Whereas when it comes to conveyance, the moment you transferred a property, you cannot call back unless under exceptional circumstances which has been prescribed by law. You cannot actually cancel such contracts. Correct? Next, even the law which governs these documents is entirely different. The contracts are governed by the Indian Contract Act 1872, whereas the conveyances are governed by the Transfer of Property Act 1882. So this is something which are the differences between contract and conveyancing. And I can give you one more example, so which we will also dwell upon in a subsequent lessons, where X Limited, now assuming instead of goods, X Limited wants to sell a property. Let us say X Limited owns a property, right? So this property X Limited wants to sell to Y Limited. However, they want to sell it after 6 months. But Y Limited don't want to take the risk. So they said, enter into an agreement promising us that you are going to sell this after 6 months. So now X Limited enters into agreement of sale. Correct? Is an agreement contract? The answer should be yes, only when it is enforceable by law. So as per the Indian Contract Act, a contract which is enforceable by law is what is, I mean, an agreement which is enforceable by law is what is a contract. Correct? So agreement of sale has been entered into by X Limited with Y Limited, promising to transfer the property to Y Limited after 6 months or within the 6 months. So here, if you can observe, there is no actual transfer of property or interest in property from X Limited to Y Limited. Correct? So X Limited to Y Limited, there was no actual interest in property or the title over the property which has been transferred. Hence, this agreement cannot be termed as a conveyance. It will be a contract. Do you get the difference now? Contract is something which has to be performed in future. So here you are promising to transfer the property in future. Hence this document is a contract. Whereas at the time of conveyance, you will enter into a sale deed. So this becomes a conveyance. So this is essentially the difference between contract and conveyance. Now, as we use the term sale deed, lease deed, mortgage deed, so what actually is a deed? So deed is essentially an instrument. So first thing you have to remember is deed is an instrument. And under this instrument, the persons agree to effect their rights or liabilities. And there are various deeds. I have given you as examples: gift deed, sale deed, partition deed, partnership deed, such family settlement deeds, lease deeds, mortgage deeds, and so on and so forth. So two things I want you to remember as to what is a deed. Firstly, deed is an instrument. And second, it is a present grant, right? So it is not a promise. So as you can see, the English meaning of deed, right? A friend in need is a friend indeed. Correct? So deed. So deed is something which you do. So deeds are things you do. So it's like an executed. Things you do is what is deed. Things you want to do are not deeds. Things you do are what are called as deeds. Hence, even applying the same meaning to the legal context. So deed is a present grant. So you're saying, yes, I'm doing this. It's done. That's all. That is a deed. It is not a mere promise which will be performed in the future. The answer is no. That I do not call it as a deed. It is a it is a present grant rather than a mere promise. So this phrase is something which you have to remember, right? So it is a present grant rather than a mere promise. So this is something which is critical for you to understand. And their deeds are necessarily to be in writing. And this instrument, again, all deeds are instrument, but all instruments are not deeds, is one statement we make. In our subsequent lessons, when we talk about sale deed, mortgage deed, we will more understand what is a deed. But for now, these two things, as to firstly, deed is an instrument and it is a present grant rather than a mere promise, is something which you need to remember. And this statement that all deeds are instruments but all instruments are not deeds, we will see how it turns out in the next slide. So instrument. So instrument is usually used for, where there is a formally executed written document. So instrument is used usually when there is a formally executed written document. And it can be attributed to its author. So usually the letters, or you can, so suppose Register of Companies, ROC, issues show cause notice. This show cause notice is an instrument because firstly it is formally executed and it is written, and it can be attributed to its author formally. So it is from ROC. So it is a instrument. Similarly, any order passed by any government authority, order in a sense not a court order, it's like an you can say a direction issued, a circular issued, these all come under instruments. All the MCA notifications, circulars, these all are instruments, right? Now it's basically a very broad meaning, or you can say instrument is broader in its ambit than a deed, because all deeds are necessarily instruments, because even there it is formally executed and it can be attributed to the people who are making the deed. It need not necessarily be in singular form, but usually instruments are something which are formally executed documents and that which can be attributed to the author. And for example, remember the show cause notices which we receive from Register of Companies, those are something called as instruments. And such instruments also record and express a legally enforceable act or a contractual duty or an obligation. So suppose you are supposed to file financial statements and you fail to file it. So ROC issues a notice, show cause notice, asking why. So here, if you can see, there is an enforceable act which was not done, and hence the ROC is taking its action based on the authority it has under the Companies Act, or based on the contractual duty which, or the duty of the company which has been missed. So in either ways, it is the authority which can issue such a document asking you to provide more information. So that is how it becomes an instrument. And third, it evidences that act, process, or agreement. So this instrument would itself stand as an evidence as to receipt of a show cause notice. So that is what is called as an instrument. Now this instrument can also be used to signify a deed, inter partes, or a charter, record, or any other writing which has a formal nature. So instruments are majorly used for formal indications. The best example I can also give you is a will. A will is an instrument because will is made by a person telling the whole world what is my last will before I die. Right? The moment I die, this is how you need to do. These are what you're supposed to do to the properties of mine. So that is what is an instrument. It is used to communicate under his authority on those properties he owns, as to how it has to be disbursed the moment he dies, or the bequeathal of the property post his death. So his or her death. So that is also an instrument, right? So now if I can put put it like pictorially, then if this are deeds, then this is an instrument. So these are all instruments, and deed is a subset of instruments, right? Cool. Let's proceed further. Now, documents. So here, let me give a very clear, or let me clarify something in your mind. So never imagine document means only something which is a kind of a paper. The moment I say document, the basic image which is created in our brains is something which is a legal nature or an A4 sheet which is folded and all the stuff. So that we think and we imagine only papers to be documents. So firstly come out of it. The General Clauses Act defines document to mean any matter expressed or described upon any substance by means of letters, figures, marks, and it is intended to be used or which may be used for the purpose of recording that matter. Recording that matter. So paper is only a medium on which we can record something which we want to say. It is not necessarily the only medium. Even if I write certain matter on a stone, even that can be proved as a document, and even that can be produced as evidence before a court of law. Hence, never be of the opinion that only a paper can be a document. Even on a t-shirt, if we write something and sign, even that can still be a document which can be enforceable in the court of law. So always remember, document need not necessarily be a paper. It can be any matter, and it is such matter which can be inscribed or described upon any substance, and it can be used for the purpose of recording that matter. So recording a matter is what is important. If you can write down anywhere, such substance can still be a document. Agreed? Right. So now again, so to give a further reference, all deeds are also documents, but all documents need not necessarily be deeds. So similarly, again, documents are further bigger bracket. Deeds also come under the subset of documents. So documents, deeds, and this is instruments. So the deeds come under the basic ambit of both documents and instruments. Instruments are documents necessarily, and they also include deeds, whereas documents is a very wide term which includes everything and anything which you draft. So these are the three important aspects, which are deeds, instruments, and documents. Interpretation of agreements. It is very important. This and the entire lesson, if you ask me the important concept, I'd say it is interpretation of agreements, which is very interesting and very important. Now, for this, we will divide the agreements into informal agreements and formal agreements. So, informal agreements are necessarily not written, usually oral. However, they still have certain validity because one of the party tries to prove before the court of law that the other party is wrong, or the other party did not, or rather it breached the terms which it has agreed upon, right? So before I go further, here I would like to further stress upon one important aspect which you need to remember as a company secretary, is that when you draft something, always look at the end picture. That if this draft, if this document is produced before a court of law, will my intention be held valid? Whatever we wrote on the paper, will it be intended, or rather will it be interpreted in the same way as we two have agreed upon? That is very important. So the language which you use, why do you think Fowler has given the five principles wherein it is very clearly said direct, simple, it has to be vigorous, it has to be lucid? Why? Well, the reason is that it has to be understood in the way both the parties have intended it to be. Only then your documentation, or sorry, only then your drafting skills are superb. If not, it is not something which is good. So it's always important for you to think the end picture as to whether, if this document goes into the court of law tomorrow to produce as an evidence, how will the court interpret it? How will a third party interpret it? That is how you have to look into your contract. So each clause you write, you have to remember that this, I do not interpret it tomorrow. Some third party interprets this clause. So where a third party interprets this clause, it is very important that your language has to be so simple that the other parties will not misinterpret or unnecessarily mislead the evidence, right? So with this in mind, let us go ahead and understand the interpretation of the agreements. So in informal agreements, the rule of reasonable expectation is something which is important to understand. So it basically tends to say that any informal agreement shall be interpreted in a sense in which the party who used the words in question should reasonably have apprehended the other party, apprehended that the other party may apprehend them. Yeah, I understand this sounds a little vague, but let me put it in a very simple way, that, how do I intend when I'm drafting something? So let us say I am the one who use certain words while drafting, right? And you are the other party. So when I use these words, how did I think that you should have understood this? So that is how I interpret this contract. So let us say I say that, um, you should supply me the goods within 15 days of me giving you a email requisition. Agreed? So now here my intention is that the moment the requisition reaches you, you should within 15 days supply me the contract, supply me the goods. Let us say I did not give you an email requisition, but I have sent a letter, like through, or not a letter, but rather say I made a phone call, and I ensured that a requisition has been made to you, but email has never been dropped. So now the other party is confused. Should I do the supply or not? Because here this person has merely informed me over phone. Now comes a conflict. You did not supply. This fellow has lost his customer. So now he files a case against you saying that he breached his terms. I made a requisition, but he did not do it. So now the language is put before the court of law to look into how to interpret. Even though it comes a bit into the concept of formal agreement, here in this example, let me assume that there is no contract written. It is rather agreed that I would send you an email and you will send me the goods. So here the intention of this party making the contract is that the moment the communication has been made to you, be it email, be it phone call, be it whatever it is, the moment communication has been made within 15 days thereof, do me the supply. So that was the intention. The intention was not to specify on an email, the intention was to specify on the communication. So here the court will, in that cases, the court may use this rule of reasonable expectation, wherein how the party who had, the party with whom you have entered into this question, or the party whose words have been misinterpreted, what is his reasonable expectation from the other party? So such expectation which is reasonable, the court will decide. So in this example, the court may also decide it is not reasonable to expect the other party to make a supply by a mere phone call. The court may also interpret saying that it is reasonable because communication is what is that matters. You yourself are not disputing that this fellow did not make a phone call. So when you are agreeing that a phone call has been made, an order has been placed, so this is a reasonable expectation from this party that adequate things from his side have been done. So stressing upon the language that an email has to be sent, how far is it reasonable will depend on case to case basis. But from this example, the only thing I want to communicate here is that, so where an informal agreement has been used, the reasonable expectation of the one party from the other will be looked into, right? So let's proceed further. Now, under formal agreements, there are two important sections from the Indian Evidence Act which you need to know. Firstly, Section 91. Section 91 of the Indian Evidence Act 1872 states that a deed constitutes the primary evidence of the terms of a contract. Correct? So this is very important. So where a contract has been entered and a particular act has been done, then the deed itself will stand as a primary evidence, because as I told earlier, providing your document as an evidence before the court is the basic achievement, or is the necessary thing, which is the necessary object behind drafting, is that it can be produced as an evidence before the court. And the Evidence Act itself highlights the fact that this deed will stand as the primary evidence of the terms of your contract. And then section 92 further says that the law forbids any contradiction of or any addition, subtraction or variation in a written document by any extrinsic evidence. Though such evidence will be admissible to explain any ambiguity. Now, for example, there is a contract which has been entered into between A and B. So both A has signed and B has signed the contract. So now, let us say there is a particular term in the contract that minimum 15 days time period is required in order for B to supply the goods to A. However, in various circumstances, in many instances, when A gave very short notice like 2 days or 3 days also, B was able to make the supply. Got it? But now let us say A in one circumstance asked for supply within 7 days. But B was not able to do it because B said, see, as per the contract, it is 15 days. So only if I would have supplied you. I don't have the required material now. So it takes 15 days time for me to make the supply. So because of this, so initially A was actually habituated for this, that at any point of time he is receiving this goods from B. So he entered into further contract with C, his customer. And now because of being unable to supply within 7 days, A had to delay the delivery to C. Correct? So with these facts, A had filed a suit against B saying that B failed to make the supply within 7 days. Now, as per section 99, this contract will stand as the primary evidence. And as per section 92, these acts, right, which is termed as the extrinsic evidence, it cannot be used as any contradiction or an addition, subtraction or variation of these terms. So this is the written document. So this act cannot be said as any addition, subtraction or variation. Just because in 2 or 3 days he was able to supply doesn't mean they have agreed on certain additional terms or certain terms have been waived off or there is a variation in their terms. That should not be necessarily the interpretation of the parties. So that is something which is very important. And however, these facts will still be taken into consideration to explain any ambiguity in the contract. So in case there is any ambiguity in the contract, then the acts of the parties or such extrinsic evidence will be taken into picture. So these two are very important sections in terms of the document or a contract which can be produced before the court as a deed. Now let us further look into how the interpretation aspect of formal agreements will transpire. The first rule of interpretation, or rather the cardinal rule, is that clear and unambiguous words will prevail over any hypothetical considerations or supposed intentions. So here, a well-established principle of drafting is something which we need to understand, right? So the principle which it is trying to set is that you should not try to look into the intention of the parties and then accordingly interpret the words. So where the words are there, try to give normal meaning to the words. Try to assign such meanings which can easily understand, through which we can easily understand what is written in a document. So if I write a supply shall be made within 15 days, do not try to go into the intentions thinking that the company cannot make a supply for within 15 days. So that was never the intention. Why do you even want to look into such an intention? Only look in the plain simple language which is used and through which you should ascertain the intention of the parties. You should not try to give the meaning to the words based on your purported or supposed intention which you believe on hypothetical considerations. That should never be the case. However, having said so, where the words used are not clear, it is complex, the understanding of the meaning or the meaning of the sentences are unable to be made. In such cases, we will look into the intention and accordingly give meaning to the words used in the contract. So it is always, the cardinal rule is first look into the words, their normal meanings, and then look into the intention in a sense, and then ascertain the intention from these words. If this is not working in sense of where there is ambiguity, in such cases try to ascertain intention of parties first and accordingly assign meaning to the terms used in the contract. So this is the cardinal rule, correct? Right. So let's move further. So in order to better understand the situations, or rather look into in various situations how a deed would be interpreted or how the consequential actions will be taken in terms of understanding the deed, I have divided it into various situations, right? So let us look into each situation. It is self-explanatory, but still let me take you through it. Firstly, where the terms are ambiguous. So this was anyways, earlier discussed in the previous slide. In such cases, what we do is we take into account the surrounding circumstances in order to ascertain the intentions, right? Cool. Second, where a contract is in two parts. One is executory and another is executed contracts. In usual cases, the later only will prevail. So executory is a futuristic, whereas executed is the thing which you are immediately entered into. So that thing which we have immediately entered, that is what will prevail, right? So terms of the later, that is executed contract, will prevail. Next, later clause in a deed destroys altogether the obligation created by the earlier clause. Imagine in a contract, clause A, or rather clause 1 or 1.1 said something, whereas 4.4 totally defeats what 1.1 says. Suppose 1.1 says supply shall be made in 15 days, whereas 4.4 says it will be made in 21 days. Let us assume 21 days. Now this has totally destroyed the obligation created by the earlier clause 1.1. What will happen in such case? In such case, this later clause will be rejected as repugnant and the earlier clause will prevail. Right? I hope this example made it clear. Now, let's go further. If certain words employed in the business or in particular locality have been used in a particular sense. So usually there are certain words which the local business might demand the usage. So in such cases, you have to give the technical meaning of it. So you have to understand in the local way, how do they use that word? Even though it has a different meaning altogether, in general sense or in as per the grammatical understanding, you should not try to assign that meaning. Only that meaning which stands in the locality, the technical sense, you have to take it in a technical sense, right? Right. Now, next situation is if the ordinary grammatical interpretation is repugnant to the general context. Okay, so in such cases, the ordinary grammatical interpretation shall not be followed. So the general context set in the contract is different. So as again the previous situation only. So where the context is trying to give a different meaning, so you will apply the principle of adjustus generis, as you would have read in your principles of statutory interpretation. So that your word will try to assign the meaning from the words or from the meaning surrounding it. So now, even though the ordinary grammatical meaning is something, but it is against the general context set in that agreement, you should not try to assign that meaning. That should not be followed. Next, antecedent facts or correspondence or words deleted before the conclusion of the contract. Right? So where certain facts have been deleted, in such cases, you should not try to consider such deleted aspects to ascertain the meaning of the terms. So where we strike off certain words, or where let us say some words have been removed, in the sense that you have striken off before contract has been signed, and both the parties have signed across that striking off. Now you need not look into the meaning of what has been struck off to ascertain why it has been struck off. The moment it's struck off means it's struck off. It is not there. It is as good as it is not even present in the contract. Right? Right. Next, evidence of acts done under a deed. So as per the deed, we have entered into, I did some acts. For example, in the previous slide, I've given you the previous slides, I've given you an example where the supply has been made in 2 days or 3 days, correct? So in the same example, that is the acts done under a deed. So can such evidence be used? Yes, it can be used as a guide to the intention of the parties. So such acts can help in understanding the intention between the parties. Next, where the main clause is clear and the contingency mentioned is in the proviso, right? So it says, let us say, the main clause is you have to supply within 15 days. However, the proviso is provided that in exceptional circumstances, that is, so you have to define what are those exceptional circumstances, which shall not exceed twice or thrice during the entire tenure of the contract. So let us say for three times during these 2 years, I can use the exceptional powers for I can ask you to supply it within 7 days. So three emergency orders can be placed from my side, and for such three emergency orders, the other party will charge 15% more than its normal fee. Okay, so now this is a proviso. However, if in the example the main clause is 15 days very clear, and I did not actually use this emergency supply thing because I don't want to pay him 15% more. My purchase order was very clear. I would have paid him only X. I never would have paid him X plus 15%, which means the proviso has never been attracted. Correct? So where such proviso has never arise, the only main clause has been used, then the language of such proviso should not be referred for construing the main clause in a manner contradictory to its import. So now, using the language used in proviso, I cannot say that, see, the intention was very clear that he can make 7 days supply. Right? So that is not at all the intention. Proviso did not arise. No, you did not trigger the proviso. So you are not supposed to take the proviso into confidence. You are only supposed to argue on the main clause. Right? So these are various situations. Now let us look into other important situations. Now, standard agreements or contracts. So usually when you enter into certain agreements or contracts with governments or large companies, I mean big corporations or large public sector undertakings, there would be a standard contract which you cannot change. Every term is fixed. There are certain blanks left, like for price or for other considerations, certain blanks are left that would be filled because they don't want to change it time and again. So they will have printed copies. You just have to write manually and strike off few things which would not apply to your case. So now, how do we look into such cases? So firstly, the court should look into the entire format of the contract without the deleted words. So the deleted words should be ignored as if they are not at all present in the contract. While if the clause is ambiguous, then only for the purpose of solving the ambiguity, you may seek assistance from the deleted words, but still deleted words makes no obligation on the party, only for you to better understand. So it's only for the assistance to the court you can look into the deleted, but initially court should not look into the deleted words. Next, if something is added in handwriting or by typewriter to a printed form, such addition should prevail over the language in print. So where we write something, correct. So where the such changes have been made, such changes will prevail. That is what is the intention, right? So these two are important in terms of standard agreements. And finally, where certain alterations have been made, but without the consent of the parties who are liable to make such a contract, right? So usually if a contract has been made and one party makes the changes either manually or however it is, then the first thing is that contract or the deed will become void with prospect to effect, because now for 15 days, suppose I change it, I remove that part 1, I delete it, so it's becoming 5 days. So it means the contract itself should be turned void. However, if the alteration is only to, or rather the alteration is not varying the intent between the parties, let us say after 15 days I wrote in the brackets 15 days, correct, 15 days was given here, so I put like this and wrote it 15 days. Now even this is an alteration, even this is without the consent of the other party, but is it in any way changing the intention of the parties? The answer is no, because I'm simply trying to put it in words, the figures in words, I'm trying to put it above, even though it's not a good practice to do so. Even if you make such thing, you have to take the signature of both the parties A and B. But still, even if such alteration is done, the other party cannot claim that this deed or this contract is void. That is wrong. In such cases, we cannot make the contract void because the whole intention has not been changed, right? So these are various interpretation principles. So I've tried to cover everything except for recitals, the interpretation of recitals. So this I will cover along with the schema of a deed. So now let us look into the other important aspects. The kinds of deeds. So these are quite one-liners, like which are like self-explanatory, but I still will try to give you a brief about it. So what are good deeds? So where there is a good title which is conveyed, that is a title of a property. Assume there's a property and everything is good in terms of the title proof, then such deed is a good deed. So it has properly transferred a title. There is no encumbrance of the property. There is no other exception. So that is a good deed. Now, inclusive deed is within the designated boundaries lands which are expected from the operation of the deed. So, inclusive deed basically covers all that land within a particular boundary. When we say that, then we call it as a inclusive deed. Now, latent deed. So it's basically called as a deed where you put a deed separately in a box, in a strong box, in leave it for 20 years. Then we call it as a latent deed. But by the it basically comes with the age of the deed. Next, lawful deed. Similar to a good deed where it conveys a good or a lawful title, we call it as a lawful deed. Pretended deed, right? Pretended deed is like on the face of it, it looks valid. However, when we dwell into the intention or the other aspects of the deed, then we understand that there is a certain legal illegality or something which is an invalidity of the deed which can be seen. But pretended, as the word suggests, a deed which pretends to be valid. Voluntary deed is something like a gift deed where there is no valuable consideration for you. So it is a voluntary deed. I'm doing it on a voluntary basis. Any donation I make to, let's say, a donation you make to PM Cares. So it is a voluntary deed. It is not something which is done with compulsion. Right? Next, warranty deed. So when you buy out a particular usually appliances, there would be certain warranties given. So such is also that is called as a warranty deed, and it contains a covenant of warranty. Next is special warranty deed. So special warranty is again a warrant. It's title only against those claiming by or through under the grantor. So it is a special. I mean, usually whoever is granting the warranty is called as a grantor. So special warranty is that I will not initiate any action against you. I will not start any claim against you. So that is what is called as a special warranty. It is kind of a protection to the person who is seeking such warranty, right? So these are various concepts. These are simple, but there are chances that it can be asked in your exams. Now, what are the types of deeds? Right. So these are also very important. Now, like whatever we have discussed till now, that A and B has entered into a contract, and A tried to do this and that. So these are called as deed pools. So as the word suggests, pool. That is, there are many people, two or more. It can be between 3, 4, 10, 11. It can be any number of people. And the more, I mean, the number of people will be usually, I mean, as the number increases, the number of copies of the deed also would increase. So usually it would be equal to the number of parties. And each party might be in possession of one original copy. So each of them will sign, either you sign on one and make a duplicate and give it to all, or you sign on as many number of parties, as many contracts you sign. Correct? So that is a deed pool. So everything usually you see in your corporate life is a deed pool. However, deed poll is something which is different. Here it is made and executed only by one party, right? The best example of it is a power of attorney. So usually say, I so and so hereby appoint so and so as my lawful attorney to do the following acts. So here there is no second party, only me. I myself am appointing someone and doing something. So it is a deed poll. So deed poll is by a single party. Deed pool is by two or more parties. And deed poll, even a arbitration award. So arbitrator passes an award which is applicable on both the parties, correct? So even that arbitration award is a deed poll because it is given by one party, correct? So it is usually drawn in first person. So first person documents are always called as deed polls. Let's move forward. Indenture. Right, so it is again, as you can see from the picture in the picture here, it is a very old concept. Indentures are also deed pools. There are more than two parties. However, it will be written. So, if I can explain you this way, this is the document. If there are two parties, it will be split into two. If there are four parties, it will be split into four. And each party will have one piece. Only when they come together, someone can execute or someone can make a change over this particular indenture. So that was the intention. The intention was where all the parties are unaware, no single party can misuse this contract. So that is what was the intention of the indenture. So if you can see closely this wear and tear of this deed. So here it has actually been torn into 4 pieces. So we can assume there were 4 parties, right? So this indenture is basically a document which is divided into as many number of pieces as the number of parties are, right? So this is what is a indenture, and the intention you can easily understand. No single person can effectually make use of such contract. And now let us see Xyrographum. It is also a similar kind of document. However, this comes under the family of deed poll, but not deed pool. Correct? Now what happens? One second. It's sorry. Even this comes under the ambit of deed pool only. So ignore this language. So this has wrongly been copied. So ignore this. Xyrographum is also a deed pool where there are 2 or more parties, but the difference is that in a xyrographum, the parties would divide the page exactly in the middle. So you make a contract top and bottom, and in the middle you will have a word written as xyrographum, and they will tear the page across this xyrographum. So tomorrow when you join it, this design should match the other part in exact same manner. Only then you can actually make an use of this particular deed. So usually to protect the title deeds, families used to enter into such xyrographums or indentures, but these were age-old practices which are no more prevalent. Finally, we have something called as deed escrow. So deed escrow, as the word escrow suggests, uh, it 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 would be a deed which would be effective only upon some condition which has been performed, right? So usual cases, it is a deed where more than 2 parties will be there. It's also a deed pool, and when the last party signs, only then the deed becomes effective. So that usually is a deed escrow. The condition is that the last party, so each and everyone should sign, and it will become effective only upon the signature of the last party, and the deed date will also be deemed to be the date on which the last party has signed the deed. So that is what is called as a deed escrow. It operates from the date it is last signed, right? So it also comes under the family of deed pool, and it would become operative only when the last party signs it. So that is what's the deed escrow, and it can be like it. The basic thing you should remember is escrow. So escrow is that only upon a condition has been performed, the deed becomes effective, and usually the condition will be every party signing it, right? So these are various types of the deeds. All right, now let me take you through the format which I strongly recommend to all my students for any deed. So for any deed, this is how you start off with the deed, and when it goes to the operative portion, that is where you use your brains, right? I don't want you to use your brains right from the beginning of the deed. So this has to become so mechanical, right? It should not take a lot of time for you to start off the deed, for you to finish the deed. So these two are very important portions or aspects of a deed. So if when you're representing your answer to the examiner, if you start the deed good and then put relevant operational clauses and then finish the deed good, that gives a very positive note to the examiner, right? So with this note, let me take this forward. Now, right at the top of your deed, so this it all the deed starts from here. So right at the top, you need to write the title of the deed. So as I said earlier, sale deed, lease deed, mortgage deed. So that basically comes in the middle of the document in capitals, usually in capitals, right? So there is no hard and fast rule that you should be in capitals. This is something which I suggest. So it comes in the middle. Next, so this is what is the intro you give. So always see the language of a deed. It is like a sentence. It goes like a flow, and it is always made in a third party. So by third party or by third person, we mean that it is made for the third person to read. So that's why I never use the words I or we. I or we are something which cannot form part of any deed pools. Got it? Now, so this nature of deed. So depends on what kind of deed you're making. Suppose it is a sale deed, then this deed of sale. It is a lease deed, then this lease deed. So the nature of deed has to come here. Is executed on the day. So that with respect to day of the week, the date, and then the month, the year. So it's like, I mean, it's for my previous batches, so it's the year. So mind the year. It is like 2020 or 2021, whatever be the year. So that is what is the date at the place of execution. So if you can read it again, so it basically necessarily says that this nature of deed is executed on so and so day, so and so date, and so month, in so and so year at so and so place. So here we are trying to give the components, if you can observe: one, the title of the deed; second, the nature of the deed; and third, the day, date, time of the deed; and fourth, the place of execution of the deed. All these play a very crucial role. The place can decide your jurisdiction. The nature of the deed will explain the third person as to what you are trying to enter here in this as part of this deed. The date will might help you in ascertaining the limitation, right? So this way everything has its own relevant play. Next, by and between, right? So here you are trying to say that this deed is entered by and between whom? This is what is called as description of parties. So if it's an individual, there is one way of describing it. If it is a corporate, there is one way of distributing. So if it is a body corporate, there is one way you will describe the party. If it is an individual, there is one way you describe the party. So if it is an individual, the way you describe the party is either it is Mr., Miss, or Mrs. Then give their Aadhaar number and the PAN. So why this? It's because if it's an individual, it is for you to identify who that person is. So the description of parties doesn't mean simply giving the name or the address. The relevance of it, what is the relevance? The relevance is to pinpoint and say that on this whole planet, this is the person with whom I'm entering into this contract. So how do we pinpoint it from crores and crores of billions and crores of population to one individual? By way of any identification number. So in India, Aadhaar or the PAN are the very important, like very relevant, by which like only you can possess that number, right? It is a unique number to you. So that's how it can help. And then reference to the father's name is very important. And then age of the person as on the date of entering, and the residence of the person, that is the address, and also the occupation. So these are certain important blocks. And then this is called as a reference. So how do you refer him throughout this contract? Are you referring him as lender, vendor, lessor, right? So here we call it as herein referred to as the so and so. If it is seller, seller. If it is buyer, buyer. So however it is referred to as a so and so, which term shall mean and include all her or his legal heir, successors. So the person, the individual entering into a contract also mean all his legal heirs are entering into it, successors are entering into it, representatives, administrators, executors, beneficiaries, who, I mean, these are all certain fancy usage of words. Because it is a format, I tried to include all, but you can simply say all her legal heirs, successors, and legal representatives, etc. So you can also end it there. The intention why we are putting it here is, what if the individual dies at the middle of the contract? Can you catch hold of the legal heir? Yes, if you have this in place. But does this necessarily mean legal heirs will be definitely be liable even if the law says otherwise? The answer is no. This is a recommended format. Correct? Next, if it is a body corporate or a firm, how do you do it? So since it's a body corporate, you will not write the name of the individual first, because at the end of the day, an individual is someone who will represent even a body corporate to sign a contract. However, you will have to mention the name of the company first. So Messrs so and so, give it SIN number or a registration number in case it is any other entity apart from a company. Again, here the object is the same, to pinpoint as to this is the company. Registered, so again the PAN will be given. So registered under the Companies Act or Indian Partnership Act or such other applicable act. So you have to write that under which act it is registered, having its registered office. So give the registered office. And next, represented by it. So whom is it represented by? Give the designation of such person, then the name of such person, and also how is he authorized? Duly authorized by the board resolution or the consent letter, as the case may be, dated so and so. So this is how you describe if it is a body corporate, correct? And again, you have to give the reference. So that reference will be given as the purchaser. So here in this case, I have taken the example of purchaser. It need not necessarily be purchaser, which term shall mean and include all its legal representatives as agents, assignees, etc. Correct? Right. Now, and and it is the other party. The other party can be an individual or a body corporate, as the case may be, as we have seen. So similarly, the same usage has been put forward here as well. So this is the first part, which is description of parties, correct? So firstly, we have highlighted what is the title, next nature of the deed, then the date, time, and then the place of execution, and then the description of the parties. Now let's move further. Now here is where let me introduce you to the concept of recitals. And for me, it is the very important component of a deed. So recital basically contains the short story behind entering into the agreement. So this is how I put forward, or I understand the meaning of a recital. So if you look at the grammatical meaning of recital, it is reciting something. So even in a deed, you have to recite the story behind how you have entered into this contract, that you are desirous of purchasing a house property, that B has an house property, that A had liked the house property of B, and they have mutually negotiated the terms, and after all the negotiations, both the parties have agreed on the following terms. So this is a simple story I have built you. So you should have this storytelling skill even in your contract through the recitals. So you have to recite what happened during this stage, like as to how you approached B, and then similarly what was the negotiation done, and what are the terms you are entering on, right? So it's a very simple story. So again, for example, I'll give you: A wants to buy a property, B has the property, A approached B, and B agreed on certain terms, and now these are the following terms. Khatam. So that's how a recital is, how simple it is, right? So it should start with whereas. So whereas is something which is trying to take you back into the past and say A. So point A is the first party is desirous of purchasing a property. Second party owns a property at so and so. And so point B will say the first party approached the second party with a proposal to buy out the property. Then point C will say the second party has agreed to the first party to sell the property subject to the following terms and conditions. Khatam. So that is what is a recital. And if you remember, I have left first and foremost, a recital will not be given any importance. Only the operative portion will be given importance. However, where the operative portion is ambiguous, only then we come to the recitals and look into what the parties are trying to convey in the recital. So where a recital says something but the operative portion says other, then the operative portion only will prevail, recital will not prevail. Then you can ask me, then why do you think recital is important? The reason why recital is important is it sets a context as to what happened before the contract. So this is important on the basis that, even in case the operative portion is utterly failed, right? It's very difficult to understand. In such exceptional situation, this recital will help you out, right? So that is why drafting of recital is very important, right? So with this brief, let's go further. Next we have is a testatum clause. So what is a testatum clause? Now this agreement witnesses as follows, right? So this is a testatum clause. This is a connection between the recital and the operative portion. So testatum clause is a connection between recital and the operative portion of a deed, right? So now this testatum is trying to say that what is this agreement trying to what is it that the parties are trying to agree upon. So I told you how they've entered into it through recital. Now the following is the operation clause. So this clause is what is called as testatum, right? So this is a very simple testatum clause. There can be more complex testatum clauses, but for a student, I suggest this is something which is relevant. Now, the next would be this entire block is something called as the operative portion of the agreement. Under the operative portion of the agreement, usually we talk about the consideration, whether the consideration has been received or receivable, and what are the operative clauses, that is the supply terms, the quality terms, or the confidentiality terms. Everything comes under the operative clauses. Then description of the property and the parcels clause. The parcels will be described in the next slide in detail, but description of the property, what the property is all about, exception, reservations, premises addendum, covenants and undertaking, these all are described in the subsequent slide. However, exceptions, reservations are like even in this agreement. Suppose I agree on so and so terms, however, subject to this is this. That comes under exceptions and reservations. Correct? Now, so after the operative portion has been given, then we have something called as testimonium clause. So this testimonium clause will usually start with the words called in witness whereof. So here it is trying to say that in like witnessing all these terms, now we are entering into this contract. So that is what is the relevance of the testimonium clause. It usually starts with in witness whereof. So testimonium saying that, so these are the terms. Now we as the following people, we agree to all the terms. That is what it says. The parties have signed this agreement with their free will and consent. Correct? So testimonium. When do you give a testimonium? When you say that this is my thought. That is what is the testimonium all about. So even here, these are the terms which I agreed upon, which we agreed upon, and hence we are signing it with our free will and consent. So this is a very simple format of a testimonium clause. And then subsequently, both the parties will sign. So signatures of both the parties is very important. And witnesses depends. Few contracts demand or mandate witnesses. For few contracts, it need not necessarily, but I suggest as a professional that witnesses has to be made mandatory so that tomorrow if something goes wrong, they can be produced as evidences before the court of law. So for each party, there would be a respective witness and their name, father address, would be something which will be specified. So this is the format of a deed. So to quickly summarize, we start off with the title of the deed, then give the nature of the deed, then the date, time, the date of execution and the place of execution also. Then we describe the parties. So after we describe the parties, we describe how the parties have entered into this contract. We narrate the story, we recite the story, which is a recital. Then the testatum clause, which connects the recital with the operative portion. Then we have the operative portion of the agreement, which contains the consideration, receipt, the operative clauses, and other clauses like the description, exceptions, premises addendum, which will be discussed later, and covenants and undertakings. And then finally, the parties will, in witness of the above terms, they will sign it. So that is called as the testimonium clause. And then we have the signature of the parties, and then we have the attestation, which is the witnesses. So this is what is a schema of a deed, which I popularly call it as a schema. I mean, I basically name it a schema. Now, if you as a student want a copy of this, then there is a form which you can find in the description below. So fill the form and we will be emailing you the format. So I sincerely suggest that this would definitely bring a lot of difference in the way you start off a contract. So in the subsequent lessons, we will look into how each contract has its own terms. So in that case, I will not go through the entire format of the contract. I will directly jump into the operative portion, because this you have to practice from your side right from the beginning. This is just a format, so it's a mechanical format. I don't want to repeat the same in every lesson. So this will be the same for every lesson or for every deed, but this will change. That is the operative portion will change, and here is where we concentrate from the subsequent lessons. So if you know how to come till here and then how to end the contract from here, this will give a very good impression to the examiner. And finally, this portion, the operative portion, will fetch you more marks, but the beginning and the end will give you the positive, the bonus points, or the bonus the bonus from the examiner will come only when you started good and then ended good, right? So this is what is a schema. Now let us look into these concepts of description of property, exceptions, premises, and covenants. Now, let us look into the components of the deeds. So, apart from what we have discussed in the schema of a deed, the components of deeds include the following. One, the parcels. So, parcels is nothing but description of the property. So, you basically describe the property as to saying that there would be a schedule of the property, under which we say all those. So usually the words used in parcels is all those. So you included, like we are trying to state as to what all comes within the ambit of the property. So the building, the land, admeasuring so and so, the extent, there is any water body inside the land, then the description of the water body. So the parcel is trying to describe the property which is to be conveyed, or the property on which certain construction will be done. That property will be described in detail in a parcels clause. Next comes exceptions and reservations. So as the name suggests, so these are the subject tos. So few things would be agreed upon in the contracts, correct? So those agreements are nothing but the covenants and undertakings, where the parties hereby undertake that I have sufficient contracts or sufficient contacts in or sufficient raw material in order to make a supply. So these are certain undertakings I make, certain covenants we make. Both of us agree, both the parties agree on certain covenants and undertakings, correct? Now, these covenants and undertakings may be subjected to certain things. Such subjected to things are what are called as exceptions and reservations. So maybe you have certain legal, there is certain litigation on the title of the property, so that you can put it as an exception or a reservation. The property is free of any encumbrance, however, subject to the following litigation which has been initiated in the following courts. So that way you can make an exception or a reservation on a particular term. Next, what we call as a premise and a habendum. So for that, like addendum, what is an addendum? Usually this addendum will be used with the words called to have and to hold. So where in a contract, where that too, it's also again pertaining to property. In a property, let us say you are trying to emphasize that only a part of it is where you have an interest on. So in that case, they use the word habendum to say to have and to hold only that particular part. You're describing only that particular part. Correct? And nowadays, the contracts do not have such words. It only talks about to have, because we do not give the entire description where we do not have an interest over it. Earlier, the entire property will be described, of which your interest will be described using the habendum clauses. But now, directly only this property will be described which you actually have, right? So there is a change shift in the practice. So these have been like age-old practices which do not hold any more significance, correct? Next, we have the endorsements and the supplemental deeds. So here this and the concept of endorsement and supplemental deeds I already explained in the schema, but I still want to emphasize on the fact that where one of the parties want to endorse its rights to the others. For example, in case of a lease, lessor leases the property to a lessee, but if lessee wants to lease it out to a sublease, on a sublease, if I want to give it to some other party, in such cases I can simply endorse the deed or endorse my obligations right at the deed itself. There can be a format for endorsement, and I can do the same to a sublease. Okay? And supplemental deeds are like all additional deeds. So any additional deed which adds on to your existing deed. For example, I want to change the terms, it becomes a supplemental deed. If I want to add some terms to the contract, then the new deed which is adding the terms to the earlier contract will become a supplemental deed, right? So these are various other components of deeds apart from what I have detailed in the schema of a deed. So thanks for watching the video. If you wish to learn more on how to draft, or you want to practice various exercises to sharpen your drafting skills for your examination and also for your practice as a trainee or as a company secretary, please fill in the information in the form which is provided in the description below. We are coming out with a course very soon. Thank you. Stay tuned to Virtual Law, and this is Prakul signing off from VL Academy.